The summer of 1889 in Coyote Bluffs baked the land into a brittle crust. The cottonwoods along the creek rustled with dry leaves, whispering secrets to the wind, and the sun, well, she just hung there like a lazy eye over a poker table, mean and watchful. Mark Dawson, just shy of 24, rode into town with nothing but sweat on his brow, dust on his boots, and debt gnawing at his heels. His daddy, rest his soul, had left behind a busted ranch and a name good for little more than a closed door. Mark worked his way from fence to fence, branding calves and mending roofs for meals and mean pay. But that summer, the letter came. It arrived with the evening stage, cream-colored with fancy writing and a whiff of lavender and saddle oil. The message was simple, elegant, and more out of place than whiskey in a church. Mr. Dawson supper. Blackthorne Range. Tonight. Come clean. Come quiet. Now, folks, round Coyote Bluffs spoke the name Blackthorne like it might set the air on fire. Eleanor Blackthorn, cattle baroness of the western ridgeline, hadn't stepped foot in town for near 5 years. They said she once tamed a wild bull with just a cane and a stare. Said she wore more silver on her fingers than most folks saw in a lifetime. So when Mark rode through the wrought iron gates of the Blackthorne Range, that sweat on his brow weren't from the sun no more. The main house sat like a queen on a throne, wrap-around porch, pillars thick as cottonwood trunks, and a door carved with roses and rifles. Inside, servants floated like ghosts, silent and sharp-eyed. At the far end of a long oak table sat Eleanor. She wore a purple riding dress, with buttons like silver bullets. Her hair was wound-tight beneath a black lace veil, and her eyes, they didn't just look at you, they weighed you. Sit, she said. Mark did. There was roast quail, chilled peach cordial, and candied pecans, things he hadn't tasted since boyhood, if ever. But it wasn't the food that turned his stomach. It was the silence between her words, like she knew something. Something about him. Finally, she spoke, eyes like twin flint stones. I don't need romance, she said. I don't need lies. I need a husband. Mark blinked. Beg your pardon, ma'am? I said what I meant. I need a name on the deed. A man to stand beside me at the bank and the auctions. The land listens better when it hears a man's voice. Mark licked dry lips. And what do I get? She smiled then, just enough to scare the daylight out of him. Security. Shelter. A place in the shade. You'll be my husband by law. What else you do is your business. Mark stared, heart pounding. The world outside offered nothing but sweat, hunger, and boots with holes. And this woman, near 70 if a day, was handing him keys to a kingdom, if he could swallow his pride. He nodded slow. All right, I'll marry you. Eleanor raised her glass. Then we understand each other. But what neither of them knew, what no one in Coyote Bluffs guessed, was that within a week of that wedding, everything would change, and not all of it would survive the summer. The wedding was held under the Blackthorne arch, 2 iron gates twisted into a shape like serpents kissing. No preacher from town was summoned. Eleanor had one brought in from Laredo, a quiet man in a dark coat with eyes like slate. Mark stood stiff in a borrowed vest, hat in hand, boots shined and nerves trembling. He wasn't used to wool suits or being stared at by silent ranch hands. They stood there like statues, watching the ceremony like it was a funeral. Eleanor wore black. Not for grief, she said, but for strength. White's for girls with futures to hope on. She murmured, just before the vows. I'm not here to hope. The preacher spoke the words, and they echoed over the sun-baked hills. When he said, husband and wife, Mark felt something shift inside him, like a door swinging shut. They signed the ledger in the study. Eleanor's signature curled like a whip crack. Mark's was simpler, nervous. Afterward, there was no dance, no cake, no kissing. Just roast beef, cornbread, and a bottle of sour rye passed between a few hands. Mark sat with his back straight and eyes watchful. He didn't smile, didn't dare. That night, Eleanor led him not to her room, but to the north wing. This is yours, she said, opening the door on a room filled with dust motes and quiet. You can come and go as you please. I won't ask questions, and I don't expect you to answer any. She paused at the threshold, then added, Just don't cross me." Mark nodded. He'd seen enough sharp things to know when one was smiling. Over the next few days, he rode the fence line, fixed a busted sluice, and wrangled a few longhorns trying to test the pasture limits. The ranch hands gave him sidelong looks, nods without smiles. He was the husband now, but not family. On the 5th day, a man came riding from the south. Lean, sinewy, eyes like nails. Name was Tobias Vane. Mark was fixing the pump when Tobias dismounted. "You're Mark Dawson?" he asked. Mark wiped his brow. "I am." Tobias nodded real slow. "Just know this, Blackthorne always finds a way to eat her own." Before Mark could ask what he meant, Tobias tipped his hat and rode off toward the canyon. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch with a flask and a mind full of questions. Who was Eleanor Blackthorne really? And what kind of shadows had he just stepped into? Out in the distance, coyotes howled. But it wasn't them that raised the hairs on his neck. It was the silence following. Something was coming. He just didn't know yet if it'd be wind or fire. Mark started poking around on the 6th day. Not to pry exactly, but a man don't sleep easy when folks start talking, like death's already at the doorstep. He noticed it first in the barn ledger. It was kept in the tack room, a thick book with cracked leather and pages yellowed by age and sun. Eleanor had told him to familiarize himself with the stock numbers and purchases, said a husband ought to know where the ranch's veins ran thick. But as he flipped through, Mark found names scratched out, numbers added up wrong. One line in particular stood out. Shipment to El Paso, 40 head. But the ranch hadn't moved a single steer in weeks, far as he could tell. He traced his finger down the page. Another shipment, another name, and every one of M with a final note beside it paid. Paid by who? That night, Mark waited till the house went quiet. Moonlight poured through the tall windows, silvering the floors like a ghost shadow. He crept down the east corridor, past the parlor and the velvet chairs that never got used. At the far end stood the study. He'd only been in there once, on their wedding day, to sign that ledger. But the door wasn't locked. Eleanor trusted him, or didn't see him as a threat. Inside, the room smelled of tobacco and old books. A fire had gone cold on the hearth. He lit the oil lamp low and turned toward the desk. Inside the drawer, buried beneath correspondence and old receipts, was another book. This one wasn't marked like the barn ledger. No title, no date. But inside, names, dozens of M. Men mostly. Some women. Some scratched through, others circled. And next to each, a number. Dawson M. $3,000. Mark stared at it. His own name, already priced and written in ink. Then, a creak from the hallway. He shoved the book back, snuffed the lamp, and stepped out into the dark, just as Eleanor's voice floated from the shadows. "Curiosity's a bitter thing, Mr. Dawson." She stepped into the moonlight, wrapped in a robe of black velvet. "I told you not to cross me." Mark met her gaze, heart pounding. "What is this?" he asked. She looked at him a long moment. Then she said, quiet as the grave, "It's insurance," and turned away. That night, Mark didn't sleep. That book haunted him, his name in ink, circled like a steer ready for slaughter. He'd married for security, but now he was starting to wonder just who was being secured. 3 days after finding that book, Mark noticed something else, an unease round the ranch, like the cattle could smell a storm the humans hadn't caught wind of yet. The wranglers kept their mouths shut tighter than a banker's purse, but their eyes flicked to the hills too often, their hands never straying far from their belts. Even O.L. Barlow, the cook, started leaving the kitchen door unlocked at night. Mark rode the southern pasture just after sunrise, hoping the rhythm of the land would still his mind. But the heat pressed down like judgment, and the sky shimmered with a fevered haze. The cattle grazed restless, heads jerking up at every shadow. Near the old well, one long since dried up, he found tracks, boot prints, not from the ranch hands. These were deeper, heavier, like someone been waiting. Or watching. He knelt, brushed dust from a small tin can hidden in the weeds. Inside, folded up tight, was a telegram. It read, "Confirmed. Target married. Proceed with caution. Her reach is deeper than we knew." T. His breath caught. Target. That word hit like a branding iron. Was it him they meant? Or Eleanor? He stuffed the note in his pocket and rode back hard. Dust flew behind his horse like a comet trail, and by the time he reached the house, sweat soaked his shirt clear through. Eleanor was already in the parlor, seated upright with a letter opener in her hand, slicing through correspondence like a butcher. She didn't flinch when he burst through the door. "I need answers," he said. She didn't look up. "I imagine you do." Mark tossed the telegram onto the table. "You're being hunted. Or you're hunting them. Which is it?" Eleanor looked at the telegram, then back at him, her face calm as a pond at dawn. "That depends," she said, "on how much you're willing to know, and how long you're hoping to stay alive." Mark's fists clenched. "This ain't what I signed up for." "No," she said. "You signed up for shelter. For protection. This," she gestured to the telegram, "is the cost of that security." He stared jaw tight. "Who's T?" She didn't answer, but her silence told him more than words. That night, he slept with a knife under his pillow. Not for Eleanor, but for whoever else might be watching from the shadows. And somewhere out beyond the ridge, a single lantern burned long after the moon rose, waiting. The next morning, smoke drifted in from the east, not the cookhouse kind, but something darker, oilier. Mark rode out before the sun got too high, and sure enough, he found the fence line burned and the ground blackened around the outer pasture. No cattle dead, just a message. When he rode back, Eleanor was waiting on the porch, a cup of coffee in hand like it was just another sunrise. "Looks like someone's testing the gate," he said. She nodded once. "They've been waiting. Circling. Vultures with law books and bank papers. But now they know I'm weak." Mark frowned. "You? Weak?" Her eyes flicked up at him. "I married you, didn't I?" He didn't answer. Part of him wanted to be angry, but another part, one that had grown up watching strong men crumble from pride, understood. "What happens if they get what they want?" he asked. "They won't," she said. "Not if you're half the man I think you are." That afternoon, 2 visitors came riding in from the county seat. Dressed fine, bowler hats, clean boots, suits that hadn't seen dirt in years. Lawyers, the kind that used paper for bullets. Mark watched from the porch as Eleanor met them in the parlor. She never raised her voice, never stood, just listened. Then she signed a single sheet and walked them out herself. Afterward, she found Mark leaning against a post. "They want the east pasture," she said, "thinking I'll fold piece by piece." "Will you?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "I'd rather burn it all before I give him the satisfaction." That night, Mark checked the barn doors twice, locked the tool shed, and kept a rifle close. But it wasn't the men in suits that worried him. It was that telegram. T was still out there. That same evening, while checking the tack room, he noticed a crate that hadn't been there before. No markings, just a faint scent, lavender and sulfur. Inside, packed neat, were sticks of dynamite. Mark didn't breathe for a second. He didn't call for help, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, looking at those red sticks and wondering if he'd married into a cattle empire or a powder keg. And the fuse might have already been lit. It was high noon when the first shot rang out. Mark was down by the windmill, patching a busted pipe, when the crack split the air like a dry branch. Echoed off the canyon wall, sharp and sure. He hit the dirt instinctively, crawling for the mesquite brush. Another shot. Closer. Not target practice. Not a warning. An ambush. He crouched low, crawling toward the wagon path that led up from the west gully. That's when he saw the first rider, a man in a gray duster, face hidden behind a kerchief, riding slow with a rifle in hand. Another flanked him, and a third held back near the ridge. 3 men, all with iron in their hands and intent in their eyes. Mark had no rifle, just the Colt strapped under his vest. The wind picked up, carrying the stink of old gunpowder and brush fire. The world narrowed, just the crunch of hooves, the click of triggers, and the slow beat of Mark's heart. He waited, let the lead rider come closer. At 20 yards, Mark stood fast, drew smooth, and fired. The man jerked backward in the saddle, rifle flying as he crumpled. The other 2 scattered, one firing wild, the other galloping back toward the ridge. Mark ducked behind a trough, firing twice more, but they were already riding hard. He didn't chase. He walked to the fallen rider, knelt beside him. Dead. Around his neck, tucked into his shirt, was a silver badge, rubbed near smooth. But not a marshal's. Pinkerton. Mark's jaw tightened. Now it made sense. Eleanor hadn't just married for show. She'd married for protection. And not just from greedy ranchers or vulture lawyers. She was running from something bigger. Something federal. That night, Eleanor stood at the edge of the barn, watching the stars rise over the hills. Pinkertons, Mark said, walking up slow. She didn't turn. They're not the first. Won't be the last. What did you do, Eleanor? She exhaled, like a woman who'd been holding her breath for 20 years. Once, she said, I made a deal with men who wore badges but served banks. I needed loans. They needed land. At first, it was handshakes. Then it was threats. Then accidents. Mark waited. I paid them off. Over and over. But they wanted more. So I vanished. Built this ranch into a fortress. I needed a name beside mine. Yours was available. Mark felt something settle in his gut like a stone. I ain't your shield, he said. Eleanor turned at last. Her eyes weren't scared. They were sharp. No, she said. You're my husband. And for the first time since the wedding, Mark wasn't sure what that meant. The days that followed were quieter, but the kind of quiet that sets a man's nerves on edge. The hands worked in tight groups, eyes on the horizon. Even the cattle moved slow, like they knew trouble was picking its way closer. Mark slept light, boots near the bed, Colt under the pillow. Every time he looked at Eleanor, he saw the cracks, small ones, sure, but they were there. Her hands, once steady as a church bell, now trembled ever so slightly when she poured coffee. She never asked about the Pinkertons. Didn't need to. She knew more were coming. On the 7th day of their marriage, 1 week to the hour, Mark found Barlow, the cook, lying face down in the dry creek bed. No bullet hole. No knife wound. Poison. A small brown bottle was wedged between the rocks nearby, half buried and corked. He rode back fast. Eleanor was waiting on the porch again, like she always seemed to be. But this time, she didn't greet him. Just said, "Who?" "Barlow," Mark answered. "Dead. Poisoned." She closed her eyes for a moment. It started. "What has?" She opened them again. The culling. That word sent a chill down Mark's back, despite the summer heat. "They'll start with the weak," she said. "The ones close to me. They think I'll fold if they cut deep enough." Mark stepped closer. "Then let me help. All the way. No more secrets." Eleanor studied him. "All right. Come with me." They walked to the root cellar beneath the storage barn, a place no one but Eleanor kept keys to. Inside, beneath bags of oats and crates of dried beans, was a trapdoor. Eleanor pried it open with a crowbar. Below, in a stone chamber colder than a judge's heart, sat boxes, dozens of them, documents, ledgers, names. "Every man who ever took money from me," she said, "and every man who ever tried to take more. Bankers, marshals, even Pinkertons. All of them bought." Mark picked up a page. The handwriting was careful, familiar. "My father's land," he said, eyes narrowing. "You bought his debt." Eleanor didn't blink, to keep it out of the wrong hands. He looked at her, fury and something else churning in his chest. "You bought me too." She nodded. "I gave you shelter. You gave me silence. That was the deal." Mark stepped back. The fire in him was growing now. "But maybe I didn't marry a baroness," he said. "Maybe I married a queen with blood on her hands." Eleanor didn't deny it. Instead, she said, "There's more blood coming. But I won't be the one to spill it this time." That night, thunder rolled over the plains, dry and distant, but not a drop of rain followed. Just the promise of fire. At dawn, the Blackthorne gates swung open, not for cattle or delivery wagons, but for war. Eleanor rode out first, dressed in a black duster and riding a blood-bay stallion. Mark followed close behind, his rifle slung across his back, eyes sweeping the trail ahead like a man expecting ghosts. Behind rode 6 men, All ranch hands Eleanor trusted more than family, all armed and silent. Each one had seen what the world could do to folk who didn't protect their own, and each one owed Eleanor something they couldn't name. They rode east, toward the freight depot near Marble Butte, where the rail lines met the banks and business got done behind closed doors and drawn curtains. That's where Eleanor said the rot started. The Pinkertons, the lawyers, even the preacher who'd married them, they were all drawing pay from the same poisoned well. And today, she was fixin' to shatter the pump. As they rode, Mark asked, "What's the plan?" Eleanor didn't look back. Justice, the kind that don't need permission. By mid-morning, they reached the depot. The men dismounted like a cavalry unit, fast, quiet, practiced. Eleanor strode up the stairs of the station office and kicked the door clean off its hinges. Inside, a man in a pinstripe vest jumped to his feet, mouth open, words caught in his throat. Eleanor raised her pistol. "Your name's Milton Carroway. You work for the bank, and you're gonna talk." I don't know," he stammered. Mark stepped forward and dropped a satchel on the man's desk. It thudded hard, contents spilling open. Ledgers, names, deeds. "Then explain this," Mark said. "Explain how a dead man's signature ended up on a mortgage sold 2 weeks ago." Milton paled. Outside, the townsfolk had started gathering. Some recognized Eleanor. Most just watched in silence. Nobody stepped in. They knew better. Milton swallowed hard. "I just file the papers." "Then start unfilling," Eleanor snapped. By high noon, they had 5 names and 2 signed confessions. One was from Milton. The other came from a clerk who'd been looking for a reason to quit. Eleanor left both sitting in the middle of the depot with their collars, wet with sweat and fear. When they mounted up to ride home, Mark couldn't hold it in any longer. "You said you wanted shelter. You said you needed my name. But what you really wanted was an army." Eleanor looked at him, her face lined with sun and secrets. "I wanted someone who wouldn't flinch," she said. "Someone who'd hold the line." Mark didn't answer, but he didn't flinch either. And when they rode back through the iron gates of the Blackthorne Range, Mark Dawson was no longer just a hired name on a marriage deed. He was a man with a cause. The day after the depot reckoning, silence hung over the ranch like a vulture. Even the wind felt cautious, slipping through fence posts with a kind of reverence, like it knew what was coming. Mark woke before sunup, boots already laced, rifle cleaned. He knew this kind of stillness. It was the kind that came right before the shooting started. Eleanor sat at the table, poring over maps and hand-drawn ledgers. Her hair, usually tied neat beneath her hat, was loose around her shoulders. She looked older, but not weaker. "Tobias is coming," she said without looking up. Mark nodded. "Thought he might. He's got 5 riders, all mercs, paid in silver and blood." Mark poured himself coffee. "What's he after?" "My land. My name. Maybe just my silence." "You want to run?" Eleanor looked up then, really looked, and her eyes were hard as winter iron. "I didn't ride through war and widowhood to run now." Mark smiled just a little. "That's what I figured." They spent the day fortifying the house. The Wranglers sandbagged the porch, loaded rifles, double-checked the barn doors. The cattle were driven out past the ridge where they'd be safe, or at least out of the line of fire. Just before sunset, a dust cloud rose on the eastern trail. Tobias Vane. He came riding, like the devil had lent him his horse, straight-backed, black duster, a silver pistol glinting at his hip. Behind him came 4 more men, grim-faced and mean-eyed. They stopped just short of the front gate. Tobias tipped his hat. "Eleanor," he called, "this don't have to get messy." She stepped onto the porch, hands at her sides. "You want my land," she said, "but you ain't man enough to take it clean." Tobias smiled, slow and cruel. "I don't need to be a man, just rich enough to pay someone who is." That's when the first shot cracked, sharp, fast. One of Tobias's men went down hard, boot twitching in the dirt. Mark stood just behind the porch beam, barrel still smoking. No more talking. What followed was fast and ugly. Gunfire lit the dusk like lightning. Dust flew. Horses screamed. Men fell. Mark shot clean, steady. The ranch hands, though outnumbered, fought like the land itself had taken up arms. When the smoke cleared, only 2 of Tobias's men remained, and Tobias himself, bleeding in the dust with a bullet through his shoulder and a look of pure hate. Eleanor walked to him, slow as a funeral march. "You always thought you'd bury me," she said, "but I ain't the one who forgot where I come from." Tobias spat blood. "You think you've won?" Eleanor knelt. "No, I think I endured." She stood, turned to Mark. "Get him off my land." Mark did, carried Tobias to his horse, and sent him limping south, with a fresh scar to remember her by. That night, the ranch was quiet, not peaceful, but settled. Eleanor sat in her rocker, a shotgun at her side. Mark poured 2 glasses of rye. "To 7 days," he said, lifting his glass. She clinked hers against his. "May the 8th be quieter." The morning after the shootout, the Blackthorne range smelled of gunpowder and sagebrush. Smoke still curled from the burned barrel, where Eleanor ordered every Pinkerton file destroyed. Not to hide, no, ma'am, but to draw a line. The past had taken enough. Mark walked the perimeter, boots dragging through ash and hoofprint. His shoulder ached from a graze, but he didn't favor it. Pain was part of the land now. He came back to find Eleanor standing in front of the old ledger. The ledger, the one with all the names, debts, blood. She was holding a pen. "You writing new names?" he asked. She didn't smile, but her voice held something softer than usual. "I'm scratching out the last one." Mark stepped closer. The name she crossed out with her own. Eleanor Blackthorn. Beneath it, she'd written, "Eleanor Dawson." He looked at her. "You sure?" She nodded. "You didn't just protect the land, Mark. You protected me. I gave you a deal, and you turned it into a life." He swallowed hard. "I came here for shelter." "You found a home," she said. There was no kiss, no music, just quiet understanding between 2 people who'd stood back to back in fire and didn't flinch. That day, the riders left. The law didn't come, and for the first time in years, the house at Blackthorne Ridge was quiet enough to hear the wind hum through the beams without worry. Weeks passed, then months. The range healed. Cattle returned. Grass grew over the bloodstains. And Mark, he stayed. He repaired fences, smoked meat, built a new bunkhouse with his own hands. He grew into the land like a seed left in the sun too long, tough, patient, rooted. And Eleanor, she aged slower now, like the fight had stopped stealing from her. They weren't lovers, not in the way stories like to paint, but they were something better. 2 survivors, 2 names on a deed, 2 souls who learned the West didn't give second chances, but sometimes it gave strange ones. And the last words Mark ever wrote in that old ledger, years later, when the cattle Baroness finally passed, were these: "She gave me her name. I gave her peace. Together, we made a house that wouldn't fall."